This is a flute, and so is this. But this is also a flute, and this, and this, and this.
Even this ocarina is a flute. And that bottle. Which raises the question, what exactly is a flute? Are you a flute? The flute is quite possibly the worst named instrument in history. Nobody seems to know what the word even means. Certainly we call something like this a flute, but we also call many other instruments flutes, and several things that aren't even instruments flutes.
Asking Google for a definition won't help you either.
A wind instrument made from a tube with holes that are stopped by the fingers or keys, held vertically or horizontally, in which case it is also called a transverse flute so that the player's breath strikes a narrow edge. The modern orchestral form is a transverse flute typically made of metal with an elaborate set of keys. Sorry Google, that's not a definition, that's a list.
And it's not even correct, because the slide whistle, also called a slide flute or piston flute, has no holes to be stopped by fingers or keys. Cambridge, Oxford, Wiktionary, and all the other common dictionaries don't help us here either. Wikipedia appears to have the closest answer to this quandary, defining flutes as aerophones producing sound with a vibrating column of air when the player's air flows across an opening.
But even this misses the mark, as vessel flutes like the ocarina or a bottle produce a vibrating body of air rather than a vibrating column of air, and yet they're still called flutes. It's like the flute's having an identity crisis and doesn't know what it is. Or does it?
Make no mistake, every instrument listed here so far is a flute. It's just that we tend to use the word flute to describe both a specific instrument, but also a couple different categories of instruments. It's a little bit like if the guitar was called the stringed instrument.
It's not that this is technically wrong, it's just incredibly vague.
If we look at our cousins, the reed instruments, their instruments are very specifically named. Under reed instruments, you can have double reed instruments and single reed instruments, and you can find conical and cylindrical versions of each. For example, a saxophone is a conical single reed instrument, and the clarinet is a cylindrical single reed instrument.
That's what makes these instruments different, their internal shapes, and while the clarinet and saxophone are both reed instruments, they have very different names to help differentiate the very different physics involved in their fundamentals. The issue on the flute is that we have no word to describe the greater category of the flute, like reed instrument or string instruments. So we have to use the word flute to describe the strange and unusual instruments in the group.
But there's actually a fairly straightforward solution to this.
If we define flutes as instruments that produce sound by using a direct airstream to vibrate an internal body of air, this neatly includes all of the instruments we've talked about so far, while cleanly excluding all the other aerophones that aren't flutes, like brass instruments and reed instruments.
Meanwhile, under flutes, we further categorize them by the shape and type of their internal air body. This would include open pipe flutes, which are tubes with at least 2 holes open to the air, one on either side, closed pipe flutes, which are tubes with only 1 hole open to the air, and vessel flutes, which are non-tube shapes. Open pipe flutes would be further classified into bore shapes, namely berm bore, cylinder bore, and conical bore, and finally, each of these instruments would come in a normal edge-blown version and a fipple version, as any of these instruments can be played with a fipple.
A fipple, for those who didn't know, is the name of the mouthpiece that directs the air for you, like on a recorder or an ocarina. I like this system because it includes all of the instruments that I can think of that fit in the flute family, but it also does this while using a lot of the categories that we were already using to describe instruments, like fipples and vessel flutes. However, it does this while also providing some extra context. For example, the recorder, which previously was only known as a fipple, is now known as a open pipe conical fipple, which makes the relationship much more apparent between it and the baroque flute, which is an open pipe conical edge-blown flute.
It also better resembles other instrument family trees and brings in some instruments that had otherwise been much more vaguely categorized. For example, the organ in this system could be considered a keyboard fipple flute, when it's otherwise sometimes described as a keyboard aerophone, aerophone being a term so vague it includes brass instruments.
I'm sure I'm not the first person to have thought about flutes like this. Certainly there's likely many people who have come before me who have thought about flutes in a similar way. but I'm just surprised that it was never taught to me like this. Historically, I feel like flutes have just been considered one more wind instrument rather than a category of their own, like the brass instruments and the reed instruments. And yet, I feel like this undermines the sheer breadth and variety of instruments you get with flutes, easily enough to rival their brass and reed counterparts. But hopefully this video can clear things up for at least a couple people and put into perspective just how wide and varied the flute world is. So what do you think of this categorization system? Can you spot any problems with it that I might have missed, or like me, are you just thrilled to have a way to explain these instruments and think about them that actually seems to make sense? Let me know in the comments.